He invited her to the wedding to remind her she was nothing, but he forgot one thing: she was no longer the woman he left behind. The invitation arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, its thick cream envelope resting on the marble countertop like a relic from a life Emily Carter had carefully buried, the embossed gold lettering catching the soft California sunlight that filtered through her kitchen windows, her name written in a script she recognized instantly, elegant but cold, deliberate, unmistakably Jason Whitmore. And for a moment her fingers hovered above it as if touching it might drag her backward in time, back to the version of herself who once believed his voice was safety instead of control, his approval something she had to earn piece by piece, but that woman felt distant now, like a character in a book she had already finished, and still, her chest tightened as she slid a finger beneath the seal and unfolded the card, reading the words slowly. His wedding, of course it was, of course he would want her there, not out of kindness but spectacle, because Jason had always needed an audience, and even now. Even at the start of his new life, he wanted her to stand in the room as proof that he had moved on to something better, something shinier, something that validated every cruel word he had ever whispered to her when no one else was listening. Emily exhaled slowly, placing the card flat against the counter as the silence of her apartment wrapped around her, but this silence was different from the one she used to know. It wasn't empty, it wasn't suffocating, it was steady, earned, hers, and she turned her gaze toward the floor-to-ceiling windows where the city stretched out in quiet confidence, a life rebuilt brick by brick, choice by choice, without him, and for a long moment she said nothing, did nothing, just stood there with the invitation between her hands like a question she already knew the answer to, because this wasn't about closure, not really. It wasn't about seeing him again or proving anything to the people who had once watched her fall apart in whispers and sideways glances. It was about something quieter, something deeper, a final test of whether his voice still had any power over her at all. And when her phone buzzed softly against the counter, breaking the stillness, she glanced down at the name on the screen, a small, almost imperceptible shift in her expression, not quite a smile but something close, something grounded, and she let it ring once, twice, before silencing it with a gentle tap, her reflection catching in the polished surface of the marble, composed, steady, unrecognizable to the woman she used to be, and as she picked up the invitation again, her fingers no longer trembling, she whispered under her breath, not as a question but as a decision, "I'll go," because somewhere beneath the calm, beneath the control, there was a flicker of something else, not anger, not fear, but clarity, sharp and undeniable, the kind that only comes after you've lost everything and built something stronger in its place. And as the sunlight shifted slightly across the room, casting long, quiet shadows that stretched toward her feet, Emily Carter folded the invitation with precise care and set it aside, unaware that the wedding Jason had planned as his final performance would become something else entirely, something he could never have predicted, because he thought he had invited his past into the room, but what was coming was her future. The wedding venue shimmered under a canopy of crystal chandeliers, each one scattering warm golden light across polished marble floors and rows of ivory chairs that seemed too perfect to touch, the kind of place designed not just for celebration but for display. And as Emily Carter stepped out of the car, the soft click of her heels against the pavement felt louder than it should have, as if the world itself had leaned in to notice her arrival, her dress simple but precise, a deep navy silk that caught the light just enough to suggest intention without demanding attention, her hair pulled back in a way that revealed her face completely, unguarded yet composed, and for a brief moment she paused at the entrance, her hand resting lightly against the cool metal of the door handle, her reflection faintly visible in its surface, steady eyes, controlled breath, no trace of the woman who once would have hesitated. And then she stepped inside, the low hum of conversation folding around her. Like a distant tide, familiar faces turning in subtle recognition, whispers beginning almost instantly, not loud enough to confront but sharp enough to be felt, and she could read them without hearing a word, the curiosity, the judgment, the quiet disbelief that she had actually come, because in their version of the story she was supposed to disappear, to shrink into whatever small life they imagined she deserved after Jason Whitmore had moved on to something brighter, someone more suitable, and yet here she was, walking forward without apology, her posture straight, her pace unhurried, as if she belonged exactly where she stood, which unsettled them more than any dramatic entrance ever could. And across the room, near the altar adorned with cascading white roses and soft candlelight, Jason stood in a tailored black tuxedo that fit him as perfectly as his confidence, his hand resting lightly on the waist of Sophia Blake, who looked every bit the image of polished elegance in a gown that shimmered with deliberate extravagance, her smile practiced, her laughter carefully timed, and when his eyes found Emily, the shift in his expression was almost imperceptible, just a fraction of a second where something flickered beneath the surface before it settled back into that familiar, controlled charm, and he leaned slightly toward Sophia, murmuring something that made her lips curve in quiet amusement, her gaze sliding toward Emily with a look that was not curiosity but assessment, as if she were evaluating a detail that did not quite fit into the scene. And Emily felt it all without reacting, each glance, each whisper, each subtle shift in energy landing against her like distant echoes rather than blows. Because she had lived through worse than this, she had stood in quieter rooms where the damage was done in softer voices, where love had been dismantled piece by piece until there was nothing left to salvage, and compared to that, this was only noise, and still, as she moved deeper into the room, a familiar tension coiled briefly in her chest, not fear but memory, the body remembering what the mind had already outgrown, her fingers brushing lightly against the small clutch in her hand as she exhaled slowly, grounding herself in the present, in the weight of the moment, in the quiet certainty that she was not here by accident, and near the edge of the room, a waiter paused just slightly as she approached, his posture shifting, his tone respectful in a way that did not quite match the way the others had greeted her, offering a glass of champagne with a small nod that lingered a second longer than necessary, and Emily accepted it with a polite thank you, her eyes briefly scanning the room again, noticing details others would have overlooked, the arrangement of staff, the subtle presence of individuals who did not quite blend into the typical wedding crowd, men in tailored suits who observed more than they spoke, who seemed less like guests and more like something else entirely, and as the music softened and guests began to take their seats, Jason stepped forward, lifting his glass to begin his speech, his voice smooth, practiced, carrying easily across the room as he welcomed everyone, thanking them for being part of what he called the most important day of his life, his words polished, charming, almost sincere, and for a moment it seemed like this would be exactly what everyone expected, a perfect performance, a flawless narrative, until his gaze shifted again, landing directly on Emily, and something in his smile changed just enough to make the air feel heavier, his tone light but edged with something sharper as he said her name out loud, drawing every eye in the room toward her at once, and in that instant, the silence that followed was not empty, it was waiting, because he believed he was about to remind her exactly where she stood, but what he did not realize, not yet, was that the ground beneath him had already begun to shift. Jason Whitmore let the silence stretch just long enough to feel intentional, his glass still raised, his eyes fixed on Emily as if the entire room had narrowed to a single point of focus, and when he finally spoke her name again, it carried with it a familiarity that felt misplaced, almost performative, drawing a few polite chuckles from guests who did not yet understand the direction this was about to take, his smile widening as he tilted his head slightly, as though addressing an old friend, rather than the woman he had once carefully dismantled, and he began to speak about the past in that same polished tone, recalling their marriage as something quaint, something instructive, a chapter that had taught him what he truly needed in a partner, his words wrapped in humor but sharpened with implication, each sentence designed to sound light while landing heavy. And the room responded exactly as he expected, a ripple of soft laughter, a few exchanged glances, the subtle tightening of attention as people leaned in, sensing the shift from celebration to spectacle, and Emily stood exactly where she was, her fingers resting loosely around the stem of her glass, her posture unchanged, her expression calm in a way that did not invite sympathy or defense, and inside, beneath that stillness, her heart beat once, slow and deliberate, not racing, not faltering. Just steady, as if it had already decided that none of this belonged to her anymore, and Jason continued, his voice gaining confidence with each passing moment, weaving a narrative where he had been the patient one, the driven one, the man held back by a woman who could not keep up, who had preferred comfort over ambition, who had mistaken stability for success, and when he gestured lightly in her direction, the motion casual but calculated, the room followed, dozens of eyes landing on her at once, some curious, some sympathetic, others quietly judgmental, and for a brief second, the weight of it pressed against her chest, not as pain but as recognition, the echo of a version of herself that would have shrunk under that attention, that would have felt the need to explain, to defend, to justify her existence in a space that had already decided her worth, but that version of Emily no longer existed, and she took a slow breath, the scent of champagne and polished wood filling her lungs, grounding her in the present, in the quiet certainty she had built far away from rooms like this. And as Jason's speech reached what he clearly believed to be its clever peak, a line delivered with a soft laugh about how some people were simply not meant for the life he had chosen, the doors at the back of the venue opened with a quiet, almost unnoticed shift in air, no dramatic sound, no sudden interruption, just a subtle change that moved through the room like a ripple, and a few heads turned. Instinctively, then more, the attention gradually pulling away from Jason's performance and redirecting toward the entrance, where a man stepped inside with an ease that did not seek attention yet commanded it all the same, his suit tailored in a way that spoke of precision rather than excess, his presence calm, controlled, unmistakably out of place in a way that suggested not that he did not belong, but that the room itself was adjusting to him, and Emily felt it before she saw him, a shift so subtle it would have gone unnoticed by anyone else, the faintest change in the way the air settled against her skin, and when her eyes finally lifted, meeting his across the distance, something inside her stilled completely, not in shock, not in uncertainty, but in recognition, as if the final piece of a carefully constructed moment had just fallen into place, and Jason, still mid-sentence, faltered for the briefest fraction of a second, his confidence catching on something he could not yet name, his gaze flickering toward the back of the room as the quiet murmur among the guests began to grow, and in that instant, the balance he had so carefully orchestrated started to tilt, not dramatically, not yet, but enough to make one thing undeniably clear, he was no longer in control. The man did not rush, and that was the first thing that unsettled the room, because in a place built on display and urgency, where every glance and gesture seemed rehearsed for effect, his pace was unbothered, measured, as if time itself adjusted around him rather than the other way around, his shoes making a quiet, deliberate rhythm against the marble floor that somehow carried farther than Jason's amplified voice ever had, and conversations that had once hovered at the edge of polite attention began to dissolve entirely, replaced by a subtle shift in focus that no one announced but everyone felt, and Emily did not move, not yet, her gaze steady, her breathing even, but something inside her softened, not weakness, not relief, but recognition, like stepping into a moment she had already lived in her mind, prepared for in silence long before this night ever arrived, and across the room, Jason lowered his glass slightly, his words trailing off into something unfinished. Something that no longer held the same weight now that the attention had slipped from his grasp, his eyes narrowing just enough to betray the first flicker of uncertainty, because he did not recognize the man, not immediately, and in Jason's world, that was unusual, he prided himself on knowing every name that mattered, every face that carried influence, every connection that could be leveraged, and yet this presence, calm and unannounced, did not fit into any category he could quickly place, which made it dangerous in a way he could not yet define, and Sophia's hand tightened almost imperceptibly around his arm, her posture still composed but her eyes following the movement with a sharper focus, the kind that measured value in real time, adjusting, recalculating, and as the man moved closer, the subtle details began to register, the cut of his suit not flashy but exact, the watch at his wrist understated yet unmistakably rare, the way the staff along the perimeter shifted their stance, their attention sharpening not out of obligation but recognition, and one of the event coordinators, who had earlier greeted Jason with rehearsed enthusiasm, now stepped slightly aside, offering a quiet nod that carried a different kind of respect, one that could not be performed, only earned, and Emily noticed all of it without turning her head, without breaking the stillness she had chosen for herself, because this was not a surprise to her, not truly, it was the unfolding of something already set in motion, a quiet alignment of decisions made far away from this room, in spaces where no one had been watching, and when he finally reached her, stopping just close enough that the shift in air between them felt deliberate, he did not look at the crowd, he did not acknowledge the dozens of eyes now fixed on them. Instead his attention settled entirely on Emily, steady, familiar, and in that gaze there was no question, no hesitation, only a quiet certainty that mirrored her own, and for the first time since she had stepped into the venue, her fingers relaxed completely around the stem of her glass, the tension she had not even realized she was holding dissolving without effort, and he spoke her name softly, not for the room, not for the audience Jason had tried to command, but for her, and only her, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than anything that had been said all evening, and then, with a small, natural movement, he reached for her hand, not to display, not to prove, but to connect, his touch light yet grounding, as if it had always belonged there, and the silence that followed was no longer waiting for something to happen, it was absorbing what already had. Because in that moment, without announcement, without explanation, the entire narrative of the evening shifted, and Jason, standing just a few feet away, felt it before he understood it, the subtle but undeniable realization that whatever control he believed he had was no longer his to hold, and as the man finally turned his gaze toward him, calm, composed, and entirely unbothered, the distance between them felt larger than the room itself, and for the first time that night, Jason Whitmore had nothing prepared to say. The silence did not break all at once, it shifted, like a tide pulling back before anyone realized the shoreline had changed, and in that suspended moment, every detail seemed sharper, the soft clink of glass against glass somewhere in the distance, the faint hum of the string quartet faltering just slightly before recovering, the quiet inhale of guests who had not yet decided whether to look away or lean in closer, and Emily stood at the center of it without moving, her hand still resting in his, her posture unchanged, but everything about her presence now carried a different weight, not louder, not more dramatic, just undeniable, and the man beside her, Alexander Hayes, did not rush to speak, did not fill the space with unnecessary words, because he understood something Jason never had, that power did not need to announce itself to be recognized, it only needed to exist. And when he finally did shift his attention fully toward Jason, it was not with challenge or confrontation, but with a calm acknowledgement that somehow felt far more disarming, his expression composed, his voice even as he spoke, "I believe you were saying something," and the simplicity of it landed heavier than any accusation could have, because it handed the moment back to Jason while quietly revealing that it no longer belonged to him, and Jason forced a small laugh, the kind meant to recover control, to re-establish the rhythm he had lost. But it did not quite land the way he intended, the edges of it slightly too tight, his grip on the glass in his hand just a fraction too firm, and as he straightened his shoulders, attempting to reclaim the attention of the room, his gaze flickered briefly between Emily and Alexander, searching for something he could use, something he could diminish, categorize, dismiss, but there was nothing obvious to grasp, no easy narrative to twist, and that uncertainty lingered in the air longer than his words, which resumed with a forced smoothness, trailing back into his speech as if nothing had changed, as if the interruption had been insignificant, but the room had already shifted, the laughter no longer as quick, the attention no longer as obedient, and Emily felt it all without reacting, her breathing steady, her thoughts quiet, because this was never about winning an argument or correcting his version of the past, it was about something far simpler and far more final, the absence of his influence over her, and as Alexander's hand remained lightly around hers, grounding but not possessive, she realized that the tension she had carried into the room had fully dissolved, leaving behind a clarity that felt almost unfamiliar in its ease, and Sophia, standing beside Jason, adjusted her posture slightly, her eyes moving between the two of them with a growing awareness that the dynamic she had stepped into was not as secure as it had appeared, her smile still in place but no longer as effortless, because she understood now that whatever story Jason had told her about the woman he had left behind was incomplete, and across the room, the subtle presence of those earlier unnoticed figures became more apparent, quiet exchanges of recognition passing between them, small nods, glances that acknowledged Alexander without spectacle, reinforcing something Jason was only beginning to sense. That this was not a coincidence, not a simple unexpected guest, but a shift that reached far beyond this single moment, and when Alexander finally spoke again, his tone unchanged, measured, he added, "We should talk after this," the words directed at Jason but not delivered as a request, and for a brief second, the weight of them settled in a way that could not be ignored, because they carried implications Jason could not yet fully see but instinctively understood were not in his favor, and Emily, standing quietly beside him, did not look at Jason for validation, for reaction, for anything at all. She simply existed in that space, steady and unshaken, and when her gaze did finally lift, meeting Jason's across the small distance between them, there was no anger there, no need to prove anything, only a calm detachment that spoke louder than any words could have, and in that single look, everything That had once bound her to him was gone, leaving nothing for him to hold on to, and for the first time since he had begun speaking, Jason Whitmore understood that whatever he had intended for this night, whatever performance he had carefully constructed, it was no longer his to control, and worse, it had never been hers to endure again. The music resumed, but it no longer held the room together the way it had before, each note floating lightly without anchoring the attention that had already shifted elsewhere, and Jason Whitmore felt it in the subtle dissonance between what was supposed to be happening and what actually was, the ceremony waiting to continue, the guests seated in anticipation, yet the center of gravity no longer belonged to him, and he cleared his throat softly, adjusting his stance as if recalibrating himself. Back into position, his smile returning with effort, polished but thinner now, as he gestured toward the officiant to proceed, because routine was something he could control, structure something he could rely on, and for a moment, it almost worked, the officiant stepping forward, voice steady, inviting everyone to settle, to focus, to return to the purpose of the gathering, but the attention in the room did not fully comply. It lingered, fractured, drawn repeatedly back toward Emily and the man beside her, as if something unspoken continued to unfold beneath the surface, and Emily allowed herself a slow breath, her shoulders easing in a way that would have been impossible an hour ago, her gaze drifting briefly across the room, taking in the familiar and the unfamiliar alike, the people who had once defined her world now reduced to distant figures in a scene she no longer belonged to, and yet here she was, not as a guest, not as an outsider, but as someone entirely separate from the narrative they had constructed around her, and Alexander stood beside her with the same quiet composure, his presence not demanding but shaping the space nonetheless, and when he leaned slightly closer, his voice low enough that only she could hear, it carried no urgency, only calm assurance, "You do not have to stay," and for a second, the words lingered in her mind, not as permission but as recognition, and she realized how different that felt, to be given a choice without pressure, without expectation, something Jason had never truly offered her, and she turned her head just enough to meet Alexander's gaze, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips, not because the moment was easy, but because it was clear, and then she looked forward again, toward the altar, toward Jason, who now stood beside Sophia with a renewed effort to appear unaffected, his posture straight, his attention fixed ahead, but his eyes betrayed him in brief, unguarded flickers, glancing toward them, searching for something he could not quite define, and Sophia, sensing the shift more acutely now, adjusted her expression, her smile bright but edged with something tighter, her fingers resting more firmly against Jason's arm as if anchoring herself to the version of the evening she had expected, and as the officiant began to speak again, guiding them into the formalities, the words felt almost secondary, a script being followed while the real story unfolded quietly in the margins, and Emily listened without truly hearing. Her mind no longer pulled backward by memory or forward by anticipation, but settled entirely in the present, in the simple fact that she was no longer affected by the man standing just a few feet away, and that realization carried a weight far greater than anything he could say or do, and when the officiant asked if anyone had any objections, the question hung briefly in the air, ceremonial, expected to pass without interruption, and for a fraction of a second, the room seemed to hold its breath, a collective pause shaped by everything that had already shifted, but Emily did not move, did not speak, because she had no need to disrupt what no longer concerned her, and beside her, Alexander remained still, his presence steady, unyielding in its quiet confidence, and the moment passed, the ceremony continuing as intended, yet nothing about it felt the same, not to the guests, not to Sophia, and certainly not to Jason, who stood there repeating the words he was given, each one landing with less certainty than the last, because somewhere beneath the surface of his carefully constructed life, something had begun to unravel, not loudly, not visibly, but undeniably, and Emily, watching it happen without reacting, understood that this was not a moment of revenge, not a victory to be claimed, but something far more final, the quiet closing of a chapter that no longer held any power over her, and as the light from the chandeliers shimmered softly across the room, reflecting off polished surfaces and carefully chosen details, she realized that she was not here to witness his new beginning, she was here to confirm her own ending, and in that realization, there was nothing left for him to take from her ever again. The ceremony moved forward as if nothing had changed, but the illusion no longer held, it stretched thin over a reality that had already begun to fracture, and Jason Whitmore felt it in every word he repeated, each vow sounding rehearsed rather than real, each promise echoing against a room that no longer responded with the same warmth, and though the officiant continued with practiced ease, guiding them through each step, there was a subtle hesitation in the air, a quiet awareness that something had shifted beyond recovery, and Emily stood still, her presence calm, her gaze steady, no longer drawn to the altar with any sense of attachment, but observing from a distance that felt both physical and emotional, as though she had stepped outside of a story she once believed was her own, and beside her, Alexander Hayes remained composed, his posture relaxed, his attention attentive without being intrusive, and when the vows concluded and the officiant invited the room to witness the union, the applause that followed came a second too late, a fraction too scattered, as if the room needed a moment to remember what it was supposed to feel, and Sophia's smile held firm, bright and flawless, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of something less certain, a brief tightening that suggested she was beginning to understand the depth of the shift she had stepped into, because this was not simply a wedding anymore. It had become something else entirely, something she could not control. And as the couple turned to face their guests, Jason's gaze instinctively searched the room again, landing once more on Emily, and this time there was no attempt to disguise it, no careful performance, just a direct look that carried a question he could not voice, because the version of her standing there did not match the one he had built his confidence around. She was not diminished, not uncertain, not affected in the way he had expected, and that absence of reaction unsettled him more than any confrontation ever could have. And Emily met his gaze without hesitation, her expression neutral, her eyes clear, offering nothing he could interpret, no anger, no validation, no trace of the past he had tried to summon, and in that moment, the distance between who she had been and who she had become was undeniable, and it was a distance he could not cross, no matter how much he tried to redefine it, and the reception began to take shape around them. Staff moving with renewed precision, guests rising from their seats. Conversation sparking again but with a different tone, quieter, more measured, as if everyone was recalibrating their understanding of the room, and Emily felt none of the pressure that once would have accompanied such attention, no urge to explain herself, no need to belong, because she already did, just not in the way they expected, and when Alexander turned slightly toward her, his voice low and steady, he did not ask what she wanted to do, he simply said, "Whenever you are ready," offering her the space to choose, and she nodded faintly, her decision already settled long before this moment, and as she took a small step forward, not toward the altar, not toward Jason, but toward the open space that led away from both, her movement was quiet but unmistakable, a shift that did not demand attention yet drew it all the same, and a few heads turned, then more, the ripple of awareness spreading again, not with shock this time but with recognition, and Jason saw it, the way she moved. The way the room responded, and something in his expression faltered, just briefly, as if he were realizing that whatever hold he believed he had over her had already dissolved, not in this moment, but long before he ever sent that invitation, and Emily did not look back as she walked, her step steady, her posture unchanged, because there was nothing behind her that required a second glance. And as the doors of the venue came into view, the light from outside spilling softly across the polished floor, she felt a quiet certainty settle fully into place, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be understood, and behind her, the celebration continued, the music rising again, the voices blending into a familiar rhythm, but it no longer included her, and for the first time, that absence felt like freedom. The moment the doors closed behind her, the sound of the wedding softened into a distant echo, as if it belonged to another world entirely, and the air outside felt different, cooler, cleaner, carrying the faint scent of evening rain against warm pavement, and Emily Carter paused for a brief second beneath the soft glow of the exterior lights, not because she was uncertain, but because she was aware of the exact point in time where something had fully ended, not with a confrontation, not with a final word, but with her decision to walk away without needing anything in return, and beside her, Alexander Hayes stepped into the same quiet space, his presence as steady as it had been inside, but here, without the weight of watching eyes, it felt lighter, more personal, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them not empty but complete, as if everything that needed to be understood already was. And Emily exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering in a way they had not all evening, the tension she had carried for years dissolving not in a single dramatic release, but in this quiet, almost unremarkable shift, and she looked out toward the city lights stretching beyond the venue, each one steady, distant, untouched by the small, controlled world she had just stepped out of, and it struck her then how much of her life had once been defined by rooms like that, by expectations she had tried to meet, by a version of herself that had slowly disappeared under the weight of someone else's ambition, and yet now, standing here, there was nothing left of that version except memory, and even that felt softened, less sharp, less binding, and Alexander's voice broke the silence gently, not demanding, not probing, simply present. "Are you all right?" And she turned her head slightly toward him, meeting his gaze with a calm that did not need to be explained, because the answer was not simple, not just yes or no, it was something deeper, something quieter, and she nodded once, her voice soft but certain. "I am," and it was the truth, not because the past had been erased, but because it no longer held any power over her, and he studied her for a brief moment, not questioning, just understanding, before giving a small nod in return, as if acknowledging a conclusion rather than offering reassurance, and a black car waited a few feet away, its presence understated yet deliberate, the driver standing nearby with a quiet attentiveness that mirrored everything else about the night, and as Alexander gestured lightly toward it, offering her the choice without pressure, Emily took a step forward, her movement unhurried, her mind clear, and as she reached the car, her hand brushing briefly against the smooth surface of the door, she glanced back once, not toward Jason, not toward the people inside, but toward the building itself, the place that had once held so much weight in her life and now felt distant, almost irrelevant, and there was no regret in that glance, no lingering attachment, only recognition of what had been and what no longer was, and when she turned away, stepping into the car, the door closing softly behind her, it felt less like leaving and more like arriving, and Alexander followed, taking his seat beside her with the same composed ease, and as the car pulled away from the venue, the lights of the wedding fading gradually into the background, Emily rested her gaze forward, not looking back again, because there was nothing left behind that belonged to her, and as the city unfolded ahead, wide and open, she understood something with a clarity that did not need to be spoken. She had not come to that wedding to be seen by him. She had come to see herself, and now that she had, there was no reason to stay. The car moved smoothly through the city, its motion steady and uninterrupted, the quiet hum of the engine blending with the distant rhythm of evening traffic, and inside, the world felt contained, insulated from everything that had just happened, as if the events of the night had already begun to settle into something less immediate, less consuming, and Emily Carter sat with her hands resting lightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the passing lights outside the window, each reflection sliding across the glass like fragments of a life she had already stepped beyond, and for the first time in a long while, her mind was not racing ahead or circling back, it was still, grounded in the present moment in a way that felt unfamiliar yet deeply right, and Alexander Hayes remained beside her, his presence quiet, his attention present without pressing, as though he understood that this silence was not something to fill, but something to allow, and after a few minutes, he spoke, his voice calm and measured. "You handled that exactly the way you needed to," and the words were not praise, not reassurance, but acknowledgement, and Emily turned her head slightly toward him, considering the weight of what he had said, because it was not about how she appeared to others, it was about how she had felt within herself, and she gave a small nod, her expression thoughtful rather than reflective of anything that had been lost. "I did not feel anything I expected to feel," she said quietly, and even as she spoke, she realized how true that was. There had been no surge of anger, no sharp pull of regret, no lingering attachment to the version of her life that had once revolved around Jason, only a calm awareness that it was over in a way that could not be undone, and Alexander listened without interruption. His gaze steady, and when he responded, it was with the same clarity. "That means it ended long before tonight," and the simplicity of it settled between them, not heavy, not difficult, just true, and Emily looked back out the window, the city stretching ahead in wide avenues and glowing intersections, and she thought about the years it had taken to reach this point, the quiet rebuilding, the small decisions that had slowly redefined her life, none of which had felt significant at the time, yet together had led her here, to this moment where she no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, not even to herself, and the car turned onto a quieter street, the noise of the city softening slightly, and as they approached a building set back from the road, its glass facade reflecting the soft lights of the surrounding skyline, Emily felt a subtle shift, not in tension, but in awareness. As if she were crossing into something new rather than leaving something behind, and when the car came to a gentle stop, the driver stepping out to open the door, she did not hesitate. She stepped out with the same calm certainty that had carried her through the evening, her heels meeting the pavement with a quiet, steady rhythm, and as she looked up at the building, its structure clean, modern, unburdened by history, she realized that this was not about replacing one life with another, it was about stepping fully into the one she had already built. And Alexander joined her a moment later, his presence aligning naturally with hers, not overshadowing, not leading, simply beside her, and as they moved toward the entrance, the glass doors opening smoothly, Emily allowed herself one final thought about the night, not about Jason, not about the wedding, but about the version of herself who had once believed she would never move past it, and she understood now that she had not just moved past it, she had outgrown it entirely. And as the doors closed behind them, sealing the quiet of the evening within a new space, the last trace of her old life faded without resistance, leaving only what was hers to carry forward. The lobby was quiet in a way that felt intentional, not empty but curated, the soft lighting reflecting off polished stone and glass surfaces that seemed to absorb sound rather than echo it, and Emily Carter stepped inside with a calm that no longer needed effort, her heels making a muted rhythm against the floor as the doors closed behind her, sealing off the outside world completely. And for a moment she paused, not out of hesitation but awareness, taking in the space around her, the subtle scent of clean linen and something faintly citrus, the distant hum of an elevator moving between floors, the quiet presence of a concierge who acknowledged her with a respectful nod that carried no curiosity, no judgment, just recognition, and it struck her how different this felt from the environment she had left behind, where every glance had carried implication, every interaction had been measured against expectation. Here there was no need to perform, no invisible script waiting for her to follow, and beside her, Alexander Hayes moved with the same composed ease, his presence blending seamlessly into the space as though it belonged to him, or perhaps as though he belonged nowhere and everywhere at once. And when he glanced toward her, there was no question in his expression, only a quiet check, a subtle confirmation that she was steady, and she was, more than she had realized. And as they crossed the lobby together, the elevator doors opening before they reached them, the timing precise without being orchestrated, Emily felt the final traces of the evening settle into something distant, no longer pressing against her thoughts but fading into the background like a story she had already finished. And inside the elevator, the mirrored walls reflected them back in still, composed images, two figures standing side by side without tension, without imbalance, and she caught her own reflection briefly, noticing not the dress or the details of her appearance, but the absence of something that had once defined her, the subtle strain she used to carry in her posture, the constant awareness of how she was being perceived. It was gone, replaced by something quieter, something more certain. And as the elevator began to move, the city lights slipping away beneath them, she allowed herself a small breath, deeper than before, as if she were finally stepping into a space where she did not have to hold anything back. And Alexander spoke after a moment, his voice low, steady. "There is something you should know," and the words were not heavy, not urgent, but they carried intention. And Emily turned slightly toward him, her attention focused, not guarded, just present. And he continued, "The company Jason is expanding into, the one he mentioned in his speech, it is already under review." And there was no satisfaction in his tone, no hint of triumph, only fact, and Emily absorbed it quietly, the information settling without surprise, because it fit into the pattern she had begun to notice, the subtle shifts, the presence of people who did not belong to that world, the way the evening had unfolded not as a coincidence but as something already in motion. And she did not ask for details, did not need them, because this was not about him anymore, not about what would happen to him next. And yet she understood the significance, not as revenge, but as consequence, something that existed independently of her. And Alexander met her gaze briefly, as if confirming that she understood. And then the elevator slowed, coming to a smooth stop, the doors opening onto a private floor that felt even more removed from the noise of the city below. And as Emily stepped out, the space beyond unfolding in clean lines and quiet light, she felt a final sense of separation settle into place, not from the building she had left, but from the life she had once lived within it, and as the doors closed behind them once more, the transition felt complete, not marked by any dramatic gesture, but by the simple, undeniable truth that she had stepped fully into a life that no longer had room for anything that once tried to diminish her. The space beyond the elevator opened into a private residence that felt less like a display of wealth and more like a statement of intention, every detail deliberate, every line clean and unforced, the floor-to-ceiling windows stretching across the far wall revealing a panoramic view of the city that no longer felt distant but within reach, and Emily Carter stepped inside slowly, not out of hesitation but awareness, her gaze moving across the room as she took in the quiet symmetry of the space. The soft textures, the restrained elegance that did not need to announce itself to be understood, and for a moment she simply stood there, her heels still, her breath even, allowing the stillness to settle around her, and it was different from the silence she had known before. This was not the absence of noise but the presence of calm, something she had built piece by piece without realizing how far it would carry her, and behind her, Alexander Hayes moved with quiet familiarity, setting aside his jacket with an ease that suggested this space was not just owned but lived in, and when he turned back toward her, there was no expectation in his expression, only a quiet attentiveness that left room for her to define the moment in her own way, and Emily walked further into the room, her hand brushing lightly against the back of a chair, the texture grounding, real, and she paused near the window, looking out over the city once more, the lights now stretching endlessly beneath her, no longer something to aspire to but something she had already stepped into, and she realized then that the night had not changed her, it had revealed her, stripped away the last illusion that she was still connected to a past that no longer had any claim on her, and Alexander's voice reached her again, steady and calm, you never needed to prove anything to him, and she closed her eyes briefly at the words, not because they were new, but because she could finally hear them without resistance. And when she opened them, her reflection faintly visible in the glass, she saw not the woman who had been diminished, not the one who had stood in that wedding years ago believing she was not enough, but someone entirely different, someone who had chosen herself without needing permission, and she turned slightly, facing him now, her expression clear, her voice soft but certain, I know that now, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than anything she could have said before, because it was not spoken in defense or realization, but in truth. And Alexander held her gaze for a moment, a small nod acknowledging what had already been understood between them, and there was no need to elaborate, no need to revisit what had already been left behind, because this was not a continuation of that story, it was something separate, something built on different ground entirely. And as Emily moved further into the space, setting her clutch down on a nearby table, the gesture small but symbolic, she felt the last thread of that earlier life slip away without resistance, not cut, not forced, simply released, and the quiet of the room remained, steady and unchanged, holding her in a way that did not confine but supported, and for the first time in a long time, there was nothing she needed to brace for, nothing she needed to anticipate, only the present moment unfolding exactly as it was, and as she stood there, looking out over the city that no longer felt distant or unreachable, she understood something with a clarity that did not require explanation. She had not just walked away from him, she had walked into herself, and there was nothing more powerful than that. The night settled deeper around the city, the lights beyond the glass shifting from scattered brilliance into a steady constellation that felt almost permanent, and inside the quiet space, Emily Carter moved with a calm that no longer needed to be reinforced, her steps soft against the floor as she crossed the room without hesitation, no longer aware of herself as someone being observed or evaluated, but simply as someone existing fully within her own life, and the silence that followed was not empty but complete, holding the kind of stillness that only comes after something unresolved has finally found its end, and she paused again near the window. Not out of habit but out of choice, her reflection faint against the glass as she looked out over the city that once felt distant and unreachable, and now felt like something she had already claimed without needing to announce it, and behind her, Alexander Hayes remained where he was, not intruding, not directing, simply present, allowing the moment to belong entirely to her, and for a long second, nothing was said, because nothing needed to be, and then Emily spoke, her voice quiet but steady. Not weighed down by the past but shaped by it, he thought I would still care, and the words were not bitter, not resentful, just factual, and Alexander's response came just as evenly, he needed you to, and that truth settled between them with a clarity that required no further explanation, because it revealed something deeper than anything that had been said at the wedding. That the power Jason believed he held had never been about strength, but about her willingness to remain within it. And now that she had stepped out of it completely, there was nothing left for him to control, and Emily let out a slow breath, her shoulders easing further as if even the memory of that weight had finally released its hold, and she turned away from the window, moving toward the center of the room, her presence grounded, her movements unforced, and she realized that for the first time in years, she was not thinking about what came next in terms of survival or recovery, but simply in terms of living, and that shift felt subtle yet profound, as if the constant undercurrent of tension that had once shaped her decisions had disappeared without needing to be replaced, and Alexander watched her with quiet understanding, not as someone observing change, but as someone recognizing it, and when he spoke again, it was not to guide or suggest, but to acknowledge, "You do not owe that past anything," and Emily met his gaze, her expression clear, her voice certain, "I know," and there was no hesitation in it, no lingering doubt, because it was no longer something she was convincing herself of, it was something she had already accepted, and as she moved toward the table where she had placed her things, setting them down with a quiet finality, the gesture carried a sense of closure that did not need ceremony, did not need validation, it simply existed, and the room remained unchanged, steady and calm, reflecting the same quiet certainty she now carried within herself, and outside, the city continued without pause, its movement constant, its rhythm uninterrupted, and Emily realized that her life would move the same way, not defined by what had happened before, not shaped by what she had left behind, but by what she chose moving forward, and as the moment settled fully into place, there was no dramatic realization, no overwhelming emotion, only a quiet, undeniable truth. She had not just survived what had been done to her, she had outgrown it entirely, and in that realization, there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to reclaim, only the simple, powerful act of continuing forward exactly as she was. Morning arrived quietly, not with urgency but with a soft, steady light that filtered through the expansive windows, casting long reflections across the floor and gently illuminating the space that now felt entirely her own, and Emily Carter stood there once more, not as someone recovering from the night before, but as someone who had already moved beyond it, the events of the wedding no longer sharp or consuming, but distant, like a story she could recall without being pulled back into it, and she wrapped her fingers lightly around a warm cup of coffee, the simple weight of it grounding, real, present, as she looked out over the city now waking below her, cars beginning to move in quiet patterns, lights shifting from artificial glow to natural brightness, and there was something steady about it all, something reassuring in its consistency, because life did not pause for moments like the one she had lived through, it continued, and so did she, and behind her, the quiet sound of movement signaled Alexander Hayes entering the room, his presence as composed in the morning as it had been the night before, unhurried, unforced, and when he paused beside her, his gaze following hers out toward the horizon, there was no need to ask how she felt, because it was already evident, not in words, but in the absence of tension, in the way she stood without carrying anything extra, and after a moment, he spoke simply, "How does it feel?" and she considered the question not as something to answer quickly, but as something to acknowledge fully, and she took a small breath, her voice calm, steady. "It feels quiet," and there was no disappointment in that, no lack, because the quiet she described was not emptiness, it was peace, the kind that comes when there is nothing left unresolved, nothing left pulling at you from behind, and Alexander nodded once, understanding without needing further explanation, and the two of them stood there for a moment longer, not in silence that needed filling, but in a shared understanding that did not require words, and Emily let her gaze drift again across the city, her thoughts not returning to Jason, not replaying what had happened, because there was nothing left there for her, no unanswered questions, no need for closure, because she had already given that to herself, and she realized then that what mattered was not the moment he had tried to diminish her, not even the moment everything had shifted in that room, but this simple, unremarkable morning where she felt completely untouched by it all, and that realization carried more weight than anything dramatic ever could have, and she set her cup down gently, turning away from the window with a quiet certainty in her movements, no hesitation, no second thoughts, just forward motion, and as she walked across the room, the light catching briefly in her reflection once more, she saw clearly what had changed, not her circumstances, not her surroundings, but her sense of self, solid, unshaken, entirely her own, and she did not need to say it out loud, did not need to prove it to anyone, because it existed without validation, and as she moved further into the space, into the life she had built with intention and strength, there was only one truth that remained, simple and complete: he had no idea who she had become, but she did, and that was all that mattered.